No one in the kitchen breathed a sigh of relief when Grace dropped the tray. The crystal hit the marble, shattered on the floor, and the seconds of silence were more cruel than the dry sound of the shards, because soon after came the low, thin, satisfied laugh of someone who had been waiting a long time for a reason to crush her. If this story already grips you, subscribe to the channel now, because what begins with a broken plate ends up tearing off masks that seemed eternal. Grace stood motionless, her hands wet with detergent, her simple uniform clinging to her back from the heat of the stove, while Mrs. Rose raised the intact glass as if holding evidence of a crime. In the illuminated room, the guests slowly turned their faces, some out of curiosity, others out of pure pleasure, and it was there in front of everyone that the mistress decided that this night would not end only in humiliation. Grace. She knew that apartment like the back of her hand, the hallway smelling of expensive perfume, the waxed wood where footsteps had to be silent, the service elevator groaning as if it also knew everyone's place. She was 47 years old, with a daughter about to lose her place at university due to lack of payment, and an old-fashioned dignity, the kind that survives even when the body begs to collapse. On the outside, in the eyes of her family. Johnson, she was just the maid who served, cleaned, and disappeared before dessert. Inside, she held the whole house together with a precision no one recognized. That birthday night, however, there was something different about the way Rose smiled, too cold, too rehearsed, as if the broken glass wasn't an accident at all, but the cue for a spectacle that needed an audience and a single victim. As Grace knelt to pick up the shards, she heard the crackle of her cell phone before the next insult. One of her employer's sons was filming everything, amused, bringing the camera close to her face as if recording a rare animal. And then Rose said, loud enough to echo through the entire room, that people like Grace always ruined everything they touched, even their own family. The phrase didn't hit her all at once. It entered slowly, sharply, because it touched exactly on the fear she had been hiding for months since her ex-husband got out of jail looking for money and threats. Her fingers bled without her realizing it, staining the shiny floor red, and yet no one told her to stop. It was at that moment, with the house in turmoil and blood spreading among the shards, that Grace saw something reflected in the broken glass and understood that the humiliation of that night was only the gateway to something much worse. The reflection in the broken glass didn't just show the living room chandelier or the expensive shoes circling around her. It showed the hem of a navy blue dress standing near the cellar door, too still to be just another guest, and a hand quickly hiding a brown envelope behind its back when it realized Grace had seen it. It was only a second, a crooked glint of paper and a red fingernail, but it was enough to send a chill down her spine. Because that house would teach her one thing over the years: rich people forgive broken plates, but they never forgive those who see what they shouldn't. Still kneeling, feeling the thin blood trickle from her cut finger to her wrist, Grace raised her eyes and met Catherine's face. Rose's daughter-in-law, white as a tablecloth. There was no contempt there. There was fear, and true fear always announces that the night is only just beginning. Grace. She had worked for the Johnsons for almost 9 years, long enough to memorize the invisible map of the house and the people within it. She knew the time when her boss Robert would turn off his smile and begin drinking secretly in his office. She recognized the scent of Rose's perfume before each dinner, where she needed to appear elegant to mask her venom. And she even noticed how the children lowered their voices when the subject involved money. This was Grace's silent gift, never recognized, never paid as she deserved. She saw what others poorly disguised. Perhaps because she had spent her life existing unnoticed. Perhaps because surviving had trained her eyes. At home, in the outskirts of Oklahoma, her daughter called it intelligence. In that penthouse in the most affluent neighborhood, they called it insolence whenever they suspected the maid had understood too much. The problem was that Grace had already been carrying too much weight inside even before that tray fell. 3 weeks earlier, her ex-husband Jonas had shown up at her door, his face thinner, his breath sour, and his usual mix of promises and threats. He said he needed money, that people were demanding payment, and that a daughter in private college was a luxury for someone who could barely afford rent. Grace hadn't told anyone, except Liza, the neighbor who sometimes picked up her granddaughter from school and knew the exact sound of shame when her voice trembled. Since then, every shift in that penthouse was also a mental calculation. Salary, late fees, tuition, her mother's medicine, transportation, groceries. Rose knew nothing of this, or pretended not to know, but she seemed to sense vulnerability, like certain dogs smell blood even before a cut opens. Catherine. She bent down to help her, but her mother-in-law stopped her with a dry look, the kind that conveys more than words. She told Grace to drop the broken pieces and go clean herself up, but she said it smiling at the guests, as if she were being generous, as if the show now needed a short intermission before the second act. Grace crossed the narrow hallway to the service area, hearing behind her the clinking of silverware resuming dinner, the laughter slowly returning, the wealthy life reorganizing itself after stepping on someone. In the sink, while the water stung the cut, she noticed something else. The cell phone Rose's son had been using to film her was still recording on the sideboard, facing the living room. And in the framing, she could see from afar, the wine cellar door appeared in its entirety. If that video had recorded the envelope, the accident might not be the focus of anything. It was then that she entered without knocking, drying her hands on her worn apron and closing the door with her shoulder. The cook was 60 years old, with bad knees and eyes that had seen her boss destroy people with the calm of someone choosing wine. But that night, her face was more tense than usual. She took Grace's hand, wrapped her finger in a clean cloth, and spoke softly, almost without moving her lips, that it wasn't the first time Mrs. Rose had plotted something before a big party. She said that half an hour before dinner, she saw Catherine crying in the bathroom and heard Robert yelling in the office about signatures, inheritance, and the police. Then she took a deep breath, brought her face even closer, and uttered the phrase that made the air in the laundry room seem to disappear. "If that recording showed what I think it showed, you're in real danger, girl, because today, someone in this house decided to choose a culprit. Grace." She didn't rush to the sideboard immediately because people accustomed to surviving learn first to appear harmless. She returned to the room in a different uniform, her finger hidden under a makeshift bandage, and her face clean enough not to give the guests the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Rose greeted her with that cracked porcelain smile and told her to serve the wine, as if nothing had happened, as if the blood on the floor had been just an ugly detail at an important dinner. But now Grace saw the room differently. Robert's eldest son nervously fiddling with his cell phone, Catherine avoiding looking at the wine cellar, Susanna, he was rushing in and out of the kitchen with tense haste, and Robert was drinking quickly, faster than someone celebrating their wife's birthday. The whole house looked posed on the outside and crumbling on the inside, like a damp wall covered with fresh paint. In the second round of drinks, Rose decided to push harder. She called Grace by her old nickname, which she hated, Rosalina, just to downplay it, and asked in front of everyone if her daughter still insisted on that college fantasy, because certain families, according to her, are born to serve, not to dream too big. There was laughter from two guests, silence from the rest, and a dry pang in Grace's stomach, not because of the cruelty itself, but because that woman would choose with surgical precision where to wound. No one in that penthouse knew about the tuition debt, yet Rose hit the exact spot of shame, as if she had too much information. Grace raised her bottle, poured a drop for the entire table without spilling, and replied only that studying was never a fantasy for serious people. It was little, almost nothing. But the temperature in the room changed because a humiliated person who answers without trembling usually frightens more than an outraged person who shouts. Catherine. She dropped her fork shortly after, the metal hitting the plate with a high-pitched sound that made half a dozen heads turn. She excused herself, her voice faltering, and headed towards the hallway. carrying a small bag that hadn't been there before. Robert followed her seconds later, the napkin still in his lap, while Rose stood too still for someone feigning nonchalance. Grace passed through the living room door and overheard a snippet of the discussion escaping from the office. Words like signature, inventory, fraud, and tomorrow morning. She didn't understand everything, but she understood enough to realize that the envelope wasn't about romance, but about large sums of money, the kind that would make an elegant family tear their own skin without sacrificing their appearance. When she returned with the main course platter, she saw that Rose's son's cell phone had disappeared from the sideboard. Someone, in the middle of dinner, realized that the camera might have seen more than it should have. Susanna. He pulled her aside in the kitchen and placed a small, cold object in her hand. A loose, tiny memory card, hastily removed from some device. He said he'd found it on the floor near the sideboard, where the boy filmed everything, and that no one seemed to have noticed its absence yet. Grace closed her fingers around it like someone holding a lit match in the dark, unsure if it could illuminate or burn out completely. Before she could answer, Rose appeared in the doorway with a serenity even more dangerous than screams. He asked Susanna to return to the stove and told Grace to go upstairs to the master bedroom to get a jewelry box forgotten on the dressing table. The request would have sounded banal on any other night. That night, after the envelope, the missing video, and the word fraud leaking from the office, it seemed like a trap set with a silk glove. Rose's room was as cold as a doctor's office, too tidy to seem lived in, and smelled of lilies and hairspray. Grace entered slowly, hearing the muffled murmur of the party in the distance, and went straight to the dressing table, but the jewelry box wasn't there. In its place was a half-open drawer, and inside the drawer, under a folded handkerchief, was the same brown envelope that Catherine had hidden near the wine cellar. The temptation not to touch it was sensible. The impulse to understand was stronger. When she pulled the paper a few centimeters, she saw the notary's stamp, recognized signatures, and Robert's name linked to an asset transfer made days before his older brother's hospitalization. The man who had until then managed the family's assets. Grace barely had time to form the idea of forgery when the door closed behind her with a soft click, and Rose's voice, coming from the hallway, sounded almost sweet as she said that now, yes, they had caught the thief red-handed. The footsteps hurried, first those of a son, then a curious guest, then Robert, already altered by drink and fear. In seconds, the room was overcrowded, all staring at the envelope in Grace's hand as if the scene had been pre-written, perfectly designed to condemn her. Rose didn't need to raise her voice. She simply asked what a maid was doing handling her employer's documents and jewelry, and the word theft slammed into the room with the force of an iron door. Grace tried to talk about the requested box, the open drawer, the envelope already being there, but each sentence seemed to worsen her own situation because the wealthy members of that family had an ancient talent, turning explanation into guilt. Catherine remained pale in the corner, neither defending nor accusing. And then Robert, in a brutal impulse of an accused man, ordered the police to be called before that woman could invent another story. No one called immediately, and that interval was worse than the threat itself. While the guests crowded at the door, feigning shock but craning their necks to get a better look, Rose asked Grace to empty her pockets. The skimpy uniform concealed nothing but a handkerchief, some bus fare, and the memory card Susanna had handed her minutes before. When the object fell into her palm, there was a second of silence, of those who announce a turning point or a verdict. Rose's son moved faster than he thought, saying that it was his, but it was too late. Grace. She saw recognition in Catherine's face, an old fear returning in Susanna and in Rose, for the first time that night, a clear crack in her control. The problem was no longer the alleged theft. The problem now was what that card could reveal. Rose. She changed her strategy with the speed of someone who thrives on manipulating crises. She stopped accusing Grace of theft, and began treating her as unbalanced, saying that the poor woman was nervous, that she had cut herself, that perhaps she was confused, that the family preferred to resolve everything calmly so as not to expose anyone. It was an elegant change on the outside and a desperate one on the inside, and Grace felt it because her boss didn't take her eyes off the memory card for a second. Robert, however, no longer seemed to be in control of anything. He was sweating on his forehead, his collar open, his hand trembling around the empty glass. A guest suggested calling building security. Another asked, half laughing, if it wasn't too much drama over paper and jewelry. And it was in this petty loss of control, spread among several mouths, that Catherine finally raised her head, breathed heavily, and said that perhaps everyone should stop lying, because if that card had recorded what she thought, it wouldn't be Grace who would be leaving there in handcuffs. She stepped forward and, for the first time in 9 years, spoke looking directly at her employer, without lowering her head, without asking permission to exist. She said she wouldn't touch anything else until the police arrived, that no one would take that card from her hand, and that there were enough witnesses in that house to prove who orchestrated the scene. The guests, previously comfortable in their role as audience, exchanged glances like people who suddenly understand they've been thrust into something too serious to be mere dessert gossip. Susanna left the pantry and stopped beside Grace without saying a word, just standing there, her weary body serving as a shield. Catherine then opened her purse with trembling fingers and pulled out the second blow of the night, a thin folder of copied documents, secretly prepared, kept precisely in case someone tried to silence her before she managed to leave that house with her reputation intact. Rose. She took a step forward, Robert another, and for a moment the room seemed too small to contain so many lies about to collapse. Catherine recounted how her brother-in-law, incapable of signing anything, had been used as a front in a scheme to transfer assets before the division of property, that she had discovered incompatible signatures, pressured her husband, and for that reason had been watched, threatened, and treated as unstable within her own family. Grace listened with her heart pounding in her throat because suddenly everything clicked. The public cruelty, the attempt to create a sting operation, the missing video, the desperation surrounding the credit card. Outside in the hallway, someone finally said that the building manager was coming up, and it was at that moment, with the door surrounded, witnesses scattered, and the truth ceasing to be mere suspicion, that no one in that penthouse could pretend to still control what was to come. The building superintendent entered, accompanied by 2 security guards, and with them, the family's elegant charade lost its composure for the first time. It was no longer a domestic conflict muffled by thick doors and expensive glasses. There were outsiders watching, listening, noticing who was trying to be too bossy and who seemed genuinely terrified. Catherine handed the folder to the superintendent before Robert could reach it, and the firmness of that gesture shifted the balance of the room. She said she wanted it documented, that she wouldn't leave without an independent witness, and that, if necessary, she would call her lawyer right then and there. Rose still tried to smile, saying that her daughter-in-law was emotionally fragile. But her voice now faltered in the corners, and her authority, once so solid, began to seem like just a habit maintained out of fear of others. Grace felt this in her body like someone who notices a wall giving way after years of leaning against it. It was the youngest son, the same one who filmed the humiliation, who broke down first. Perhaps because he was too young to withstand real pressure. Perhaps because arrogance without protection turns into cowardice very quickly. When one of the security guards asked that no one approach Grace or the card until the police arrived, he exploded, said it was absurd, pulled his cell phone from his pocket, and tried to delete files right there, in front of everyone. The mistake was as stupid as it was revealing. The building manager took the device before he completed the gesture, and Catherine, trembling but lucid, stated that the video from the room recorded the moment Rose entered the room before telling Grace to go upstairs. It was the missing detail. It didn't prove everything on its own, but it debunked the main lie, that the maid would find the envelope on her own, driven by theft or criminal curiosity. When the police arrived, the house was no longer the scene of a simple accusation, but of conflicting accounts surrounded by too many people. Grace handed over the memory card with a firm hand that wouldn't feel all night, and recounted, without embellishment, everything from the broken tray to the staged sting operation in the bedroom. Susanna confirmed what would come in the kitchen and the hallway. Catherine revealed what she knew about the suspicious signatures, the veiled pressures, the attempts to make her appear mentally unstable to disqualify any future accusation. One of the officers requested immediate access to the contents of the seized cell phone and the memory card, and the tension became almost tangible in the air, as if each second between the request and the opening of the files was a stretched cable about to snap. Rose crossed her arms to appear serene. Robert sat on the edge of the bed like a man who, for the first time, saw ruin without being able to buy it back. The video lacked perfect sound and clean framing, but it had enough, and sometimes enough is everything. It showed Grace kneeling on the living room floor, picking up the shards, Rose observing the scene, and in the background, it clearly captured Rose herself, appearing in the hallway minutes later, entering the master bedroom with the envelope in hand, while everyone was still distracted by dinner. Shortly after, the same video recorded the employer returning without the envelope and calling Grace to come upstairs and get a supposed jewelry box. No one needed to overinterpret. The trap was there, raw, inelegant, real. The son who filmed it out of cruelty ended up preserving the evidence that his mother never imagined would exist. And the public humiliation, constructed to crush a maid, became precisely the mechanism that dismantled the family's version in front of witnesses, security guards, the building manager, and the police. Robert. He tried to salvage what remained by accusing his wife of acting alone, but his haste backfired when he contradicted schedules, documents, and motives already mentioned by Catherine. Pressed, he said too much, mentioning his hospitalized brother, admitting to arguments about signatures, and almost confessing his goal of buying time until he could regularize paperwork that, according to him, was technically resolved. That phrase buried him. Catherine closed her eyes for a moment, not in victory, but in mourning for what the family truly was. Grace simply stood there, feeling a shiver run down her spine when one of the police officers told her that at that moment, she ceased to be a suspect and became a victim of false accusation and harassment. Rose didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't plead. She simply lost the face of an untouchable lady and revealed something smaller, poorer, uglier. A woman accustomed to using humble people as disposable rags and who was finally discovering the price of that. Grace. She left the penthouse around 3 a.m. without her tray, without the invisibility suit she had worn for so many years, and without the old stoop in her shoulders. The building's hallway seemed different, although it was the same cold marble, the same yellowish lights, the same service elevator that had so often swallowed her in silence. The difference was in her. Susanna went down to the lobby with her and squeezed her hand longer than any words could convey. Catherine stayed to give her statement, but before the door closed, she looked at Grace with a tired, almost embarrassed gratitude. Like someone who understands too late that courage sometimes comes precisely from those whom the world has trained to obey. Outside, the early morning air hit Grace's face with a pleasant roughness, and she took a deep breath as if she were learning, at that moment, the exact length of her own name. In the following days, the footage circulated among lawyers, testimonies, and nervous messages from people who would never have dared to contradict Rose before. The theft story died quickly. What remained was the staged embarrassment, the attempt to use a domestic worker as a scapegoat, and the rottenness of a family that believed a salary also bought silence, submission, and human discard. Grace didn't become a headline heroine or a miraculously fearless woman. She remained worried about her daughter's tuition, her sick mother, and Jonas looming as an unresolved threat. But something essential had changed. Now she spoke, looking people in the eye, recorded everything, demanded receipts, demanded respect, and for the first time formally sought her rights without apologizing. Sometimes liberation doesn't make the sound of victory. It makes the sound of a lock opening. On a gray April afternoon, Grace waited for her daughter to leave college, sitting on a concrete bench, still damp from the rain, a simple bag in her lap, and the memory card tucked away at the bottom of her purse like a tangible scar. When the girl appeared at the gate, tired, beautiful, and full of hope for the future, Grace simply stood up and hugged her with the quiet strength of someone who had almost lost everything and yet hadn't lost herself. Traffic churned, splashing rain on the avenue. The São Paulo sky descended heavily on the buildings, and yet, at that moment, there was a dry, steady light devoid of spectacle. Not because the world had become just, but because, after so many years of being treated as if she occupied the smallest place in the house, Grace had finally learned a truth that no one could ever take away from her. No one was born to be humiliated. If this story has stayed with you this far, subscribe to the channel and stick around, because every time the truth finds its voice, someone who seemed too small changes the course of everything.